Thanks for joining us for today's discussion between Stacey Slater and Vicki Yang about growing and engaging remote and hybrid teams. Before we get to today's discussion, some preliminary information. We will be keeping chat open for comments and discussion. We've already gotten a little bit of practice using that. During the presentation, if you have a particular question that you'd like our speaker to answer, instead of putting it in chat, we are going to use Zoom's question and answer functionality, including thumbs upping any questions that you'd like to see answered. So no need to repeat those, but if you see something that you would like to help us prioritize and help our speakers prioritize answering, please thumbs up it, and that will basically be how we take those questions during 15 minutes after the discussion, get through as many of those as we can, and have some time for following up with you all about any follow-up questions. And now a quick word from our organizers and sponsor. This event has been organized by HR Chief and People. HR Chief is an HR-focused job board, resource center, and community dedicated to improving the human resources and people operations industry. We strive to make work engaging, equitable, and impactful. We empower people leaders to make a positive difference in their roles. Check out HR Chief at hrchief.com. People gives HR people ops and recruiting professionals a place to connect, ask questions, share best practices, and learn from one another. Started in 2016 and hosted by HR Chief, People includes over 9,000 members from all over the world. Apply to join the community at a new link, hrchief.com/joinpeople. We'll also drop those links in the chat if you'd like to apply to be a part of that community. This event is sponsored by our friends at Oyster. Oyster is a specialized global employment solution that consolidates all your global employment needs in one place. Onboard, pay, care for, and manage full-time talent and contractors worldwide, with or without a foreign entity. Hire compliantly anywhere and handle all employment functions from an integrated, automated solution. It's easy to go global with Oyster. As a special offer for attending today's webinar, you can get 20% off Oyster for the first 7 team members for 12 months. There's a special link to use to sign up to use that offer. Should be in chat. It's oysterhr.com/partner-referral/HR-chief. Also at oysterhr.com. Our speakers today are Vicki Yang and Stacey Slater. Vicki Yang is a people leader with over 20 years of experience across a huge range of industries and company sizes, from SaaS startups like Looker and Bonusly to behemoths like Google. She owns the consulting practice Victoria Young Consulting, where she is a fractional people leader for a number of organizations. Through her work, Vicki builds equitable and inclusive people programs and processes to help companies be successful. Our other speaker today is Stacey Slater, Global Talent Acquisition at Oyster. Stacey's no stranger to global hiring. With nearly a decade in talent acquisition, she's expanded teams at Nexmo, Onfido, and MessageBoard, and now spearheads Oyster's global TA team to actualize remote hiring visions. Having hired over 300 humans across more than 70 countries, Stacey is the driving force between Oyster's talent strategies and programs. With a focus on TA strategy and through leading the global talent acquisition team, Stacey is committed to revolutionizing remote hiring and has also graced the RecFest stage. And now on to our panel chat. Remote work has had a huge impact on the way we work individually as ourselves and also together on teams. Along with the opportunities come challenges, and our speakers today are going to discuss what that means for us and as team members and as HR professionals. Vicki and Stacey, turning it over to you. We'll start with our first question, and this will probably go to Stacey. Curious about how growing remote and hybrid teams is different or unique than growing traditional in-person workplaces.
Wow. So I think that there's a few key factors in terms of the differentiators there. And I think a lot of that comes down to understanding your readiness as an organization and when you are growing remote and hybrid teams, what that looks like. You need to be able to really factor in a number of different key elements when it comes to the types of job functions that you're looking for, the communication needs of the business, the way in which you go about it. So if you are growing teams on a remote or hybrid basis, the world can literally be your oyster, but there's a lot of key elements within that when it comes down to compliance, understanding and navigating the nuances of employment within those particular countries that you're potentially identifying talent in. So there's a few key factors there when it comes to how you go about it, but ultimately creating an environment that's going to be conducive for everybody to have that experience, whether you be remote or hybrid, is super important. Oh, think we've lost some sound.
Apologies about that. Stacey, thank you very much. Stacey, it sounds like there are a lot of places you could start. How do you think about prioritizing where you start, identifying roles for team members, remote or hybrid
Mm,
environments,
mm.
and what skill sets are important for various roles?
Yeah, so I think the job functions are really important to look at. So, really assessing the essential tasks and the responsibilities, regardless of work location, right? What are those core attributes that you're looking for? As an organization, I mentioned earlier about being remote ready as well, right? You need to make sure you've got the mechanisms in place when you're bringing employees into an environment that's setting them up for success. So, looking at the technology, the systems, the processes, the way in which you operate as a business when you have individuals that are in remote or hybrid roles, to really make sure you've got a set level playing field there, and everyone's pushing forward in the right direction. I think one of the things when you're looking at scaling staff and particularly on remote and hybrid, it's so important, as is if you're in office, to have a very clear vision and those values that you have in place, and making sure that you're being guided by those decisions at all levels, right? There's a lot that comes into play with it, but ultimately you have to make sure you've got that alignment as a business. I think leadership development is super important in that, in making sure that that translates through to your leaders and what you're expecting them to set the tone of, when it comes to scaling as an organization. Practically as a TA function, in the way that we look at things, it's a wonderful thing to think you can put someone anywhere in the world. It truly, truly unlocks access to so much talent. But you do have to think about time zone constraints, how folks are going to collaborate. Are you making sure that you've got that connectivity in place to make for those successful relationships and operationally as a business moving forward, right? So you've got to have those conversations and considerations when you're looking at time zones and collaboration needs as well. Um, and working remote or hybrid, it is a unique skill set, right? We look at things we like to call remote readiness, at Oyster. And it's really important to make sure that you're assessing folks through the process to make sure that they're bringing the skills, the proactivity, the confidence, the self accountability that you need in order to be able to operate when you are in that remote or hybrid setting. You need to be resilient. You need to have that adaptability, self-sourcing in what you're doing, to really set you up for success. So it's super important that you don't forget to identify, assess, and understand what's going to make that human successful in that role when you layer on that remote and hybrid element, for sure.
Thanks, Stacey. Appreciate it. Vicki, I know you have some experience with employee engagement, particularly with remote teams. I'm curious, if you've got a team in place that is working remotely, how do you engage them and overcome any challenges that may come from being remote? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it also, Stacey touched on some of this already, is looking at like, how do we make sure we're creating alignment, sharing information, and setting people up so that they know how to make decisions in the absence of like kind of being close to somebody else, either physically or even like time zone wise, being able to say, hey, this just came up, how do I deal with it, right? Because if you're 8 hours apart, it's already going to create this kind of gap. And so I do have several clients who operate in, some of them are hybrid, like partially hybrid and remote. Some of them are completely remote. And that clarity, especially around goals, around mission, vision, values, becomes super important, because that's the foundation for how you're going to do a lot of that work. Even having kind of philosophies on how you do some of this stuff, how the product team operates, what is their job, how do they make those decisions, even with the people team, like if we're talking about compensation, for example, how do we think about compensation? In order to keep people engaged, you want to make sure you have some of these structures in place. Another really great example is having job competencies, because engagement is closely tied to career development. So do we know what pathways look like? Do we know what job expectations look like? How do we measure that? How do we have those conversations? That is going to be much more important than, let's say, some of those smaller things like team building activities, which are also equally important, but in a different way. I think getting those foundational things of really, what goals are we setting? How are we doing that work? how does my career look like here? How do I get the support that I need is going to help tremendously with that engagement piece.
I like it. It reminds me of the line, company culture isn't a ping pong table, but it really goes much more foundationally to, the actually important stuff. Stacey, any follow-up thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, the ping pong table, but company culture isn't what you write on your office wall, right? If
Right.
you indeed have an office nowadays. Yeah, I think it's how you show up as well, right? And embody those behaviors, and model that for your teams too. I think on the engagement side of things, it's very easy to operate without intent sometimes when things happen organically in an environment, right? And you've got to remember where you've got hybrid employees who will have both those in-person moments and those remote moments. If you're balancing that with your remote employees, you've got to make sure that you've got a shared experience there, and that comes with intent. To echo what Vicki was saying, the thing that really resonates most with me is transparency. Like, as an organization, it's so important to make sure that you're transparent with your expectations, the ways in which you're working as a company, as a team, as a department, and nothing is more important than being intentional with your communication. Top down, bottom up, it works always when you're operating in that dual environment.
Thanks, Stacey. You mentioned communication and transparency, and I think one thing that I've seen bosses struggle with that I think is kind of related in remote and hybrid environments is trust, which I think is very related to communication and transparency. I think hybrid and remote work benefits a lot from trust, but I'd love to hear from you both about ways you see that play out in the real world, any strategies to share about fostering trust or improving trust over time for remote and hybrid teams. Stacey, do you want to start?
Do you want me to go first on that one? Yeah, I
Kick it off.
think gosh, so many. The one thing that I have observed is like cultures have evolved, right? The way that we work has evolved, and when we were in the office, there was this notion of presenteeism, right? You've got to be there, you've got to be seen, you've got to be staying late, you've got to have that presence amongst, and that's just kind of taken a different form now when you're in a remote or hybrid role, right? It's the tools and the technology are still almost encouraging that mindset of making sure your green dots on and you've got you're seen and you're all over those Slack channels or whatever it is that you're using. And I think to build trust, it's so important that you are, being clear in those expectations, but also making sure that as leaders, you are embodying that behavior in the way in which you want to see your team operate, right? You need to build a safe environment. And doing that in a remote or hybrid way means being able to say to your team, it's the output that I'm really passionate about here. I don't need to see you at all hours of the day, especially when you're working across time zones, right? With folks, it's sometimes easy to get sucked in to do that. So making sure that your team truly understands that they've got your trust means really giving it to them, and not looking at the micro and looking at the output and the end results on that front as well. So I think it takes time to build, and I think you need to be really intentional with those touch points and those moments that you create with your employees to start that. And that process starts right at the beginning, all the way when you're starting to onboard and grow, and even hiring, right? Do what you say you're going to do, have those actions there, and form those relationships with your employees to make sure that you're creating that safe environment. It would be my absolute foremost thought on that. I think it's not rocket science, but it's easily forgotten, right, when you get busy in the day-to-day.
Yeah, I would echo everything Stacey just said. And I think one of the biggest things we do, especially if you're trying to grow a company and scale, is we just start doing things, right? Whereas I think if you're looking at hybrid and remote, specifically setting that foundation, again, going back to how are we setting people up, creates that trust and builds that trust. And the more clarity you can give and the better communication you can have, then the better that trust is going to be. One thing that I liked what Stacey said about communication and transparency, it's huge, absolutely imperative if you're doing this work remotely, because especially in different time zones, right? You're having different conversations all the time. And if you're not sharing kind of the decisions that were made, the topics being talked about, if it's not captured somewhere where someone who's asleep can go and pick up in the morning, and have their input in as well, then that trust is going to start breaking down. So I think really staying consistent with those things, being clear about how you all communicate that, being clear about what the goals are, that impact piece and what you're trying to deliver is so important, because without that, then we're going to default to, is that green dot on? Is that person answering emails enough, right? When in the absence of information, we fill it with assumptions, and that's never a good thing. And the way to get rid of that is to be, again, really clear, lay things out, write stuff down, especially if you're working with US companies. We're very low context. We like things written down. We like that specificity. And I think that's something important to pay attention to.
That's great. Thank you both. It does sound like trust is foundational. I'm curious, as you think about growing teams remotely in hybrid situations, beyond just trust, what are some of the other processes and systems that you can start, instead of being a little bit more reactive? How can you be proactive about other foundational aspects of growing and expanding teams in remote situations? Stacey?
Yeah, I think when you need to, it sounds so base level, but you really need to have a plan, right? Like, where is it that you're going to go, and what is going to work for your business, right? And what's going to set your folks up for success. It can be really, really tempting to just go, oh, okay, let's go for it. Oyster, it can be overwhelming sometimes when you realize you literally have over 180 countries around the world that you can grow and hire talent from, right? Where do you start? And I think it's really, really important when you're going through that process to come at it from a business lens, but also don't forget the cultural nuances that go with that expansion into new countries, new areas, and individuals that come from a different world to you in some respects, right? So it's really, really important to come at this with a considered and empathetic approach, and make sure that you're being clear in what the goal is, right? In that growth and that expansion. I think it's really important, and Vicki touched on this earlier about development and being able to have growth opportunities within those roles as well. We would always say it's so important to think about internal mobility, but also the practicalities around that. If you're in a remote working environment, you need to understand the logistics and some of the parameters within that, right? From a compliance perspective, how do you navigate that as a business? What's your take on that? Employees need information, right? Otherwise, to Vicki's point, they fill in the gaps, they make assumptions, and then whoops, all of a sudden you'll find yourself in a little bit of a predicament, and people's expectations aren't met, or they're broken. And so it's so important to go about putting those building blocks in place. Take it slow is my advice, right? You don't need to go running into every location in the world, or hiring every single role, remote or hybrid. You need to really give it some thought, test the waters, and seek the feedback from the business. As you're growing and expanding, it's important to maintain the barometer in terms of how the organization is adapting to that and how you are evolving as a business as you go forward on those new paths.
Yeah, one of my clients is completely global. And one of the things that we talked about was when they were trying to set up or hiring more on the engineering team was, one, where do we want these people located and why? And then are there a mix of senior engineers and junior engineers in the same space and within the same time zone roughly, so that they can get support quickly if they need it. And so it's, I think, thinking through those things and strategically helps, because then you can kind of anticipate what might come, and like 1000% what Stacey said, take it slow. I feel like when companies like Oyster came on to the scene and became this bigger thing, and with the pandemic and everything, was like, okay, we can hire super remotely now, and then suddenly it was like, okay, let's hire anywhere, and it's like, well, no, wait, don't do that just yet. Like, have you thought about how you're going to do compensation? Have you thought about what that looks like too when they find out how much folks in the US make versus how much they make? Have we set up how we talk about this? Is the talent that we need in that space, can they also work, if we're a heavily US based company, do they have some of that skill set to work culturally with the US teams or with US clients? And I think it's those kinds of things that, making a list and starting that planning and building that foundation can be super helpful. because then you're testing your assumptions. You can go back and check, is this actually right? Is this going to work for us? And then start really small. Another company I know wanted to start outsourcing some of the engineering team outside the US. I was like, okay, we're going to start with just a team in Mexico. Let's see if it works. If we can get this to work, then maybe that means we can expand into other locations.
Yeah. And I would just, the last thing I would tag on to that as well is like lean into the expertise around you or the expertise that you have available to you, right? It is not just an effort that you will make in isolation. You know, we work so closely with our legal team, with our compliance team. You know, we really make sure that, you know, from a strategic perspective, everything's wrapped in around go-to-market strategies. Like we're being very, very clear in where we want to go and how we want to do it. But the international knowledge that you need when you are employing in new countries, it is so incredibly nuanced, and there's some phenomenal expertise to support you in that. Don't be afraid to seek those answers earlier, right? You often bump into it when you go, TA, you know, for our sins, we're lovable rogues, but we will bring you the problem. We'll bring you the human in that, you know, country we've never hired in before, and we'll go, let's make it happen. And you have to, everyone go, oh my goodness, how do we make that happen? And it's really understanding in those markets, what's payment like there? You know, are they on a 12 month? Are they on a 13th, 14th month? What does that translate to in terms of benefits, bonuses, statutory? You know, meal cards, like there's so many different things that come into play dependent on where you are hiring. And it's the employee that's impacted if you try and run before you can walk, right? So if you don't have that expertise yourself, then there are organizations out there that can support that and are set up to be able to provide you as a human resources function with that to your fingertips. So ultimately you can serve your employees in the best possible light.
And then one other thing I'd add to that, Stacey had mentioned this when we were talking before, was like, as you, not just physical location, but also the size of your company as it's growing. There's going to be different pain points that happen at 50, at 100 employees, at 300 employees, and, you know, so on and so forth. So what does that impact look like? How much are you trying to scale this year? What does that look like? And what would happen then if you're going to expand physically? So thinking about those inflection points and what that will change within your own company, regardless of where you're located. And if you are going to add extra locations, what is that impact also going to be on that?
Absolutely. You all have mentioned so many hypotheticals and questions to answer that sort of mirror some of the discussions that I see in the people forums, people asking for references or resources around particular issues. I'm curious if you all have any favorite places to point people who are trying to answer these sorts of questions, or anything that's been useful to you as you have grown in your role and expertise.
I mean, selfishly, I mean, as an organization, we are so passionate about building in public. And so one of the things, to Vicki's very early point around documentation and setting the operating model, the operating rhythm when you are in a remote or hybrid world, I would absolutely say the Reef, which is an open source employee guide that we do have, and it really sets out kind of, you know, the tooling and how you go about doing meetings, how you work, how we work as a company, how you work as an individual. So really providing those examples of, you know, what it could look like, with the flexibility to obviously, you know, be able to align that to your business, your mission, your values, and your goals. So yeah, those things are really helpful. Like even just like, how do I do a good handoff if I'm, you know, logging off remotely, and I'm going to be out time zone wise, there's something super urgent. Like, what does that look like? What's expected from an asynchronous form of communication versus meetings, right? Because how many people have been remote but suddenly find themselves in meetings all the time? Like, what do we use that time for, right? And so how to do that is really, really important. And Oyster definitely has got a lot of great resources there to support that, especially around how we use the tooling as well. Another very quick favorite of mine is Pin. So I love Pin. They've got some phenomenal templates. Again, an open library there when it comes to employee communications, career journeys, like talking around development points with managers, like really, really good Q&A format in there. Like if I were to do this, what would I think about? How would I go about it? There's some amazing communities and resources out there to lean into.
Very
And I just
cool.
want to
Vicki?
plug Oyster's Reef again, because I've definitely taken
You
stuff
like
from
the
their
reef?
materials.
Nice.
I do like the reef. And I'm actually going to share another link. I have no affiliation to Post Hog whatsoever, but I love
yeah.
how they laid out their handbook and
Yeah.
even their like departments and kind of what they do, because I think that creates such clarity for themselves and also for people looking to join them. And so having something like that, and there's a lot of, I feel like 100% remote companies typically do a pretty good job of this, and there's so much open source material now. Definitely look for those things and start there and see, make sure you're taking a lens of like, you know, what would work for us, because it's really easy to copy paste. But yeah, Post Hog's one of my favorites for those things.
Nice. That's great. Yeah, thanks for the links and resources, everyone. Last question before we move on to Q&A, and anyone who is attending, if you do have a question that you would like Vicki or Stacey to discuss, please drop that in the Q&A section of Zoom and thumbs up any questions that you would like to see answered. Last question for you all, Stacey and Vicki. I'm curious, as I think one thing that I've seen from remote teams do over the last couple of years has been do more in-person retreats, big events, big old get-togethers to get some face time. I'm curious how you think about the value of in-person communication, what that looks like, organizing that sort of event, what the value is, how you go about organizing something like that or selling it internally. Excuse me. Yeah, any thoughts about retreats and in-person communication in a remote world?
I mean, if the company can afford it, I would say definitely do it at least once a year for, you know, 3 to 5 days, however long you all can kind of make that work. Because the energy that happens inside that time, and the energy leaving it and kind of what happens afterwards is just magical. I can't think of any other word to explain it, just because I've seen the effects of it. And there is this like creation of like stories with each other, of actually seeing and connecting and, you know, putting faces to names, heights to people instead of these little boxes that we sit in.
What is it about heights? Everyone
don't
wants
know.
to, we're talking about this today. It's like, where do you sit on that barometer?
And it's just this wonderful way of like getting to know each other and then walking home with those stories and that connection, so that you know better who you're working with. Which we can definitely do online and through very structured things as like, you know, team building activities, all that. But being able to do it in person at least once a year, I think is invaluable and just adds to that ability to work better together.
Yeah, I think to your point, it's that we were having this conversation the other day, actually. It's that understanding you get of the individual as a human. For some reason, like through a virtual screen, like I have incredible relationships across the organization, and we're very lucky that we create space and time to have that social interaction as well, right? But there is something extra special. I think to your point, Vicki, I mean, absolutely, if you have the funding to do that. We have been in a market where some things have had constraints, and those have been the things that have dropped. But I was also think about being creative as well. If you can't do it in person as a company, look at your locations and see if you've got hubs. Right. We have like different crew channels at Oyster. So we'll find like in certain countries, we've got clusters of individuals. And we recently did a co-working day virtually in person around those hubs, and everyone sharing photos and stories from those experiences. Everyone similar time, similar place. It can't be the same because some people are sleeping while other people are working when you're so global as we are. But then coming on and seeing all of those photos and those images shared on our Oystergram the next day was so lovely, because you kind of in a way feel like you're there, but you're not. And it doesn't have to be a big event. It can just be co-working, right? And grabbing lunch and just having those moments where you can see how tall people are, but also, you know, kind of that humor behind people and those more kind of deeper connections that you can form.
That's great. Vicki, you mentioned the energy coming out of an in-person event. One job that I worked many years ago, this company was celebrating their 15-year anniversary at a dude ranch out in Colorado the week that I started. And so I was brand new to this company, hung out at a dude ranch in Colorado with a bunch of 70 new people. It was massive, a lot of fun, set some very unrealistic expectations for the rest of my time there. But it was a great start to get to know everyone and then be able to put a name to a face and vice versa. And you're right, a lot of energy coming out of that in-person time for sure.
Yeah, and I do want to add, because obviously some companies can't make this happen right now, or maybe it's so global, the cost is too high. But if you're still intentional about these activities, like I have one client who has a person who focuses purely on social activities and team building activities, and they're very intentional about making sure that happens. And it still creates a feeling of getting to know each other too. So, I don't want to kind of downplay that aspect.
No.
But if you can do both of them, it helps a lot.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Vicki and Stacey. Really appreciate the conversation. If anyone would like to connect with either of our speakers after the webinar, here is their LinkedIn info, just their names at LinkedIn. We will also get to Q&A momentarily, but first, a quick word from our sponsors. We do have that special offer from Oyster today. We also have a poll if anyone would like outreach from our sponsor or today's speakers. We have this follow-up poll. Either Oyster, the People Slack community, Victoria, or all of the above. Feel free to vote for one of those. We'll leave that open for a minute while I talk through some Oyster details, and then we'll get to Q&A. Thanks again to Oyster for sponsoring this event. As a reminder, Oyster is a specialized global employment solution that consolidates all of your global employment needs in one place, so you can onboard, pay, care for, and manage full-time talent and contractors worldwide with or without a foreign entity. Hire compliantly anywhere and handle all employment functions from an integrated automated solution. It's easy to go global with Oyster. Again, that special offer for attending today's webinar, you can get 20% off Oyster for the first 7 team members for 12 months. That link, along with some of our other links, will be dropped in the chat by Ben. Thank you, Ben. Feel free to click through those and take advantage of that offer. We will now close the poll and move on to Q&A. We will keep Q&A open, so feel free to, as we're talking through this, drop any additional questions or thumbs. We will take about 15 minutes for this, so try and get through a lot. No guarantees, but let's see what we got. Cool. One question from Ben. How do you structure career development opportunities for remote employees? What does that look like?
Oh, this is my favorite topic. I love talking about career development.
Go on.
I would say, it's the piece we have, you have hopefully your job competencies and kind of like, here's the roles we have, and here's how you would, excel from, move from one level to another. And I think that's really important. But when we talk about career development opportunities, it's really trying to break people out of that mindset, though, of like, here's a ladder and I'm supposed to go up it. Maybe I move on to the people manager side and I go up it. But really, it's like, what are the skills that you want to learn? What is it that you want to do and that you love doing? And having the conversations to talk about those pieces, and then help them see how the stuff that they're working on right now is supporting those pieces. And sure, it might be, I want to be a people manager someday, or I want to be a VP of sales. And so you can talk through, and if you have job competencies, great, you can go through that ladder and kind of talk about, hey, here's the skill sets you need. I'm giving you this project so that you are able to work on that. It's actually that part of it that is so important, because people know that they're doing work, but sometimes they don't see how that work aligns to how they're developing their career. And it's really important to have those conversations. Also, as a people manager, to understand what is it that your people love doing, don't love doing, and where do they want to go? Because then you can help create better alignment for that piece as well, and then increases engagement.
I would add one more thing to that, which is from the remote or hybrid perspective. When those opportunities arise, and we are so passionate when it comes to internal mobility at Oyster, and it's something that we've dedicated a lot of time and thought to. It's so important that those opportunities are visible. Whether you're remote or whether you're hybrid or in office, we need a place. So we have a dedicated Slack channel, which is Core Oyster Jobs. And every time a role goes live that's eligible for internal application, it is announced in that channel, and the core information is there and it's taken through. So there is a visibility at any point. People can go in and see that. They might want to use it to make referrals instead of applying themselves. The other piece is when you are doing internal mobility and you're interviewing internally for roles, it is so critical, to Vicki's point, that you're collecting very constructive feedback throughout that process, and that feedback is translated and shared with the individual, whether they're successful or not, right? So if they are successful, they've got immediate development points and opportunities built into their onboarding and their ramping to support them upskilling. If they're not successful, to their knowledge, then it's up to them to take that back to their manager and be able to start creating a pathway, right? Building those connections, maintaining that connection with the team internally to start hitting those development points that have been identified, so they're ready for that move next time round when they get to that next point. So I think it's so important that it's visible, that it's constructive, and that's a loop that is continuous when you are looking at internal opportunities for career development.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. We spent a lot of time talking about some of the foundational aspects of remote work. Kenzie has a question here that I think is a little bit more on the day-to-day level. Curious about what kind of remote activities you've tried that were successful to create more ongoing engagement with employees. What does that look like?
So many different, and I think that the key here is trying, right? Because you're not going to succeed on the first go, and also everyone's unique in what works for them. I think activities for, I can speak, from a leadership perspective with my team here. We do silly little things like as a people-wide team, we have a question of the week that we have within our channel, and it rotates and everyone asks, and it's a really nice way to build trust and gain more understanding of each other, to really kind of help you form those connections. We make sure that we have dedicated time to play as a team, right? It gets very easy to just pop your head down. You're at your desk every day, you're doing your work. So we have a lot of game activities. Big fan of Luna Parks. If no one's used that before, it's a really great way to bring people virtually into a room with lots of really cool, fun activities. If you're not the most creative person like me in thinking about these things all the time, it's a really, really helpful way to do it. So I think you have to try. And I think as well, like as a leader as well, bring your team into this, right? It's everyone's responsibility to take that opportunity to build that engagement and that connection. We've just set an action as a team that we will be doing on a monthly basis, a monthly social, no work allowed, like space for us as a team, because you just get so into it with the work. We love what we do, and sometimes we forget that we need that moment to play. So it's everyone's responsibility as well. So hear your people, bring new ideas, and you'll learn so much, especially if you've got a remote team, about all these things that are going on around the world. Like so many things you learn. You think, wow, I had no idea. And you get such an insight into other humans and their worlds.
Yeah, that the getting your team involved. I knew a design team who actually they would go round robin as to who had to come up with the activity or the question for the day or the meeting, and super fun. I think great. I do the same thing with my teams when I was had teams reporting to me. One other thing, if you're thinking from like a company perspective, is definitely, again, kind of being intentional about what you're doing and trying, right? So it could be, I love how my client does, they do social activities. So it's like people actually share kind of something they're good at. So it's not work related. You get to learn something new about people. They also do team building ones, which is like, we teach something. So maybe they read an article and they talk about it, or someone comes up with like I actually recently developed and ran a strategic thinking workshop for them. They did another one on, how do we maybe have healthier conflict? And so if you can think of things like that. Also, how are you celebrating and recognizing each other? Like peer-to-peer recognition is so important, I think, especially if you're remote or hybrid. So things like Bonusly, Taco, there's so many, Donut, right? CultureBot, a lot of those tools can also help with some of this. And then the last thing I'd say is like celebrating the wins of the company. This goes back to the communication and goals and alignment piece, right? If we know, what people are doing that's being celebrated, and what our company wins, one, it gets us excited because we work here, and then two, it's like, oh, that's the stuff that we care about and that's important, and here's how we're doing against those things that we're looking at and trying to accomplish.
That's great. Yeah, I like the idea of learning and teaching from everyone else on your team, even outside of a work capacity. One question that we have in Q&A here that might be slightly related to that is Ben would love to hear more about setting up local hubs. How do you start those and how do you keep them sustainable?
Ooh, it depends what angle you're coming from with hubs, right? So some folks from a hiring perspective, when they are looking remotely, they will specifically target hubs to build out teams from, which is one way of going about it. And I've been in organizations where we've done it before. So you might have a regional hub that's grounded in a specific location in APAC, for example, or in Europe, right? And then you get clusters of employees, and then organically you might lend itself more to a hybrid environment in that sense if you've got folks in and around locations closer to an office. We look at things like crews at Oyster because we genuinely are not trying to specifically put certain numbers of humans within a set location. For us, really, remote working is fully remote, right? And that is a really important point because every business will define it differently. It might be remote, but you have to be on site 1 or 2 days a week, or it might be remote, but actually I expect you to work and it's not so flexible. It's within this parameter or this travel route and so on and so forth. So when you're setting up those local hubs, again, it has to come back to like, what does that mean to you? And what are you trying to foster in terms of an environment, a feeling, a productivity, from having that in place? Sustainable, I think, again, it comes down to your growth strategy, right? And your expansion strategy as an organization. So if you're looking to suddenly grow 1,000 people within the EMEA market, and your TA strategy is such that you have to just hire those people in London, then you're going to be, really losing out on a big pool of talent within the region. Cost is going to be different in terms of what the salary scales and the market's like in that place. So you've got to really, really think about that. If you want 1,000 people in Europe, then maybe you've got a small hub in Portugal and a little bit of a crew over in Madrid, or it's Spain as a whole, and it's a countrywide one, and people can connect and come together within those moments, whether it be quarterly or monthly. I mean, Spain, I'm going to say it now, is our most sociable team. They get together so much. I literally see on the channel all the time. I'm like, I'm so envious of everyone in Spain. In London and in the UK, we're a little bit more dispersed and a little bit less sociable. And they always look like they're having the best time. So be strategic in how you want that to evolve organically or intentionally, and then really about sustaining it. It comes down to what that growth strategy looks like and the commitment, right? Have much like a lot of communities have chapter leads, right? We like to have individuals that are encouraged to take on that realm, right? I'm gonna be the one that's gonna hold the flag in the air, and we're all going to meet at this point and we're all going to do it. And I think it's important to make sure that people have that opportunity to guide and lead. Like anything, you got to cajole people together. It takes intent and effort.
Nice. Vicki, any thoughts?
No, I think Stacey's covered most of it, so not much to add on my side.
Super. That sounds good. One question that we got through chat, which didn't make it into Q&A, but I've got it pulled up here. The question is, I've been working at a startup for 3 years and I'm working with first-time founders. How do you effectively make a case for investing time and effort into building a strong foundation of people ops and employee experience? We've done a pulse survey, but there's no follow-up because they're juggling so many additional items. I've been pushing hard to get them to care, and I've been running out of ideas. We're a Series A startup. The early stage grind is very real. Thanks for your insight.
Oh, that is definitely tough, and I've been there. And I think one of the things is really, it goes back to, what do they prioritize, and how does this work then kind of respond to that? Or it's like, how is this going to help that? How is this going to what is going to resonate in how we lay this out? There's a concept called employee lifetime value, which maybe some people have heard of, some might not. If you Google it, you'll see this little graph that comes up that kind of talks about how much, and it does make it really like very like, okay, humans are a resource. So I'm a bit ambivalent about using it, but it definitely works sometimes with founders. So I'm going to use this example because it talks about, okay, so if we ramp them faster, they're going to make greater impact sooner. If we develop them, they're going to make greater impact throughout their time at the company. And then of course that'll taper off if they get close to leaving. But if we can keep them engaged, then you can keep them longer. So that's the whole idea, which, in some fronts, then with a person, like that's helpful because they want to grow, they want to learn, they're developing their career. And I think if you're able to kind of talk about it in maybe those terms, or, look at like, okay, so what is it that you're trying to accomplish? If we want the company to be successful, we need to create greater alignment with, across our goals, have better communication. These team building activities are going to increase the ability to do that, right? So it's kind of leading them along that math problem too, like how does what we're doing here plus what you want equal greater success? So without knowing kind of the details and nuances is probably the best answer I've got.
And I think the age-old analogy, right? Like the foundations upon which you're building are what are going to hold you up, right? When it comes down to that continued growth. And having worked for a number of startups, it's my MO for my sins. I love it. Some people don't. That it's very you're building the plane while you're flying it, right? Is the age-old analogy that you use. But nothing is more important than those foundations. When you attach it to one of the things that I found really, really helped resonate with the business, and to Vicki's point, it comes back to the business objectives, not why I need it as someone sitting in the people team, but why this is important to the business. The second you can get on if your company runs, I'm a big fan of OKRs, but if you're running objectives and key results as a business, the second you can get a stake on there and you've got a contributing goal project that you're working towards that really is going to impact growth, whether it be from a revenue number, and it looks at the value that the talent's providing that is impacting that top line goal, that's going to really start to resonate with the business. Data is also really, really impactful and really, really powerful. So if you're looking at retention data, if you're looking at exit data, right? If you're looking at engagement surveys, there's so many different touch points there that you can bring in. Speaking with numbers, data and impact points is really going to resonate more with your founders and with your executive level team. And so getting people on there is so impactful and so important. Keep trying. And if they're not hearing what you're landing, then have a think about the way in which you're positioning it, because communication is the response you get as well. Sometimes you might just have to try a few different angles in order for it to stick.
Nice. There's a related question in Q&A. How do you help executives get on board with opening up more remote position opportunities? And I suspect a lot of that, I wanted to address that or give you all the opportunity to address it in case there are particular aspects, but it feels like a lot of what you all just talked about in terms of approaching things from a business perspective would apply to persuading an executive that remote is an opportunity and not a cost, or not about the particular person. Any additional thoughts about that?
I mean, I would go on, Vicki.
No, go ahead, Stacey.
I mean, I'm the biggest advocate because my whole team has been unlocked by remote, right? So if you're at a growth phase, if you're looking to build your business or you're competing for talent within the market, having a talent ocean rather than a pool or a puddle is so important. And there's so much incredible access to talent you get when you start looking at remote, right? The world is very different now. COVID and that remote working experience human beings started to realize what the trade-offs were, right? And so being able to have that flexible working is something that's super important, and it becomes a competitive edge when you're talking to talent in the market, right? I'm also hugely passionate about providing equal access and opportunity to humans. And I think it's so important if you're a mission-led business and you're a people-centric, human-first organization, it is something that genuinely makes a huge difference. But also think about the skills that you're accessing and the perspective and the diversity that comes in by having humans sitting in different locations. There's a huge amount of value that comes with that, right? But I would always divert back to my TA lens on this. And it really is about being able to, as an organization, give yourself the best opportunity to access truly the best talent out there for you and provide that opportunity moving forward. It will increase speed when it comes to hire and quality when it comes to being able to compete for those fantastic individuals.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is, because I had to do this once, so it was really looking at, okay, so if this is what we want to get in terms of talent, here's why going remote would be helpful. Here are the challenges here's a way to address those challenges, and kind of laying out that whole thought process for the CEO and our head of finance. help make the case. It still took about 6 months before I convinced them we would finally do this, but also because the 3 areas we were hiring in really were very highly paid. And so it was really eventually the cost that also helped me win that argument.
Interesting. Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Remy has a question about closing gaps of communication and workload between several departments being primarily remote. For example, aligning with other managers who aren't able to see the work your department is generating each day and without telling them every single day what is going on.
I feel like this is the challenge that we're still facing. We're still figuring out how to solve.
Update?
It goes, I think, back to, it depends on how clear you are, especially with like OKRs and goals and how transparent it is. So if you can increase transparency around those things about this is what we're trying to accomplish, this is how we're measuring if we do that correctly, that does make this easier. If you don't have anything like that set up, then your first step, I think, is to start doing that. The other thing that also works really well is weekly updates, to be honest. Like, we've done things where it's like, okay, here's the stuff that we're working on, here's our priorities for the week, and everyone having to report on that. Again, it just creates better transparency and also helps the team too, because I had team members who are like, I don't think that person's doing as much work as I am. And so there's no visibility in that. And it starts to develop some like feelings of resentment, and being able to see, hey, here's what everybody is working on. Here's our progress towards it. And having those check-in meetings and status update meetings can be helpful.
And the only other thing I'd add to that is right at the beginning, the planning, right? Particularly when it comes to cross-functional dependencies and raising that visibility. So the better you can get at your planning processes when it comes to your quarterly sprints, your projects, how you're operating, making sure that input is there, the less someone's going to be hit off guard and then realizing, you've got a blocker because of these workloads. So it's really, really important.
Totally. Vicki, I've definitely run into the issue of teams getting resentful, myself getting resentful when it's not clear. You feel like you're putting in the work and you're not seeing the progress from other teams. You don't know what's going on, but that the pure lack of visibility can be a challenge for sure. Cool. One last question from Kenzie. Best advice for building out internal mobility processes with a fully remote company? I assume this means moving between hubs or moving between countries. What might that look like?
In my past life, although the company was more remote, not so much remote as like hybrid, really, it was a bit of both. It's being clear about what those factors you're going to take into consideration are. Like, do you have to have been in that role already for X amount of time? Because it does take about a year to 18 months in some roles for it to show value. And if you start and then try to move 6 months in, we've wasted kind of all of that time hiring you for that particular role, right? Or the person for that particular role. So really developing like clear criteria about when this can happen, how it works, the internal interview process, how do we make sure it's equitable and fair? Making sure all of that is laid out. This goes again back to like, let's build the foundations and the philosophies about why we're doing this. What happens to your compensation if you decide to move from, let's say, California to Colorado or California to Spain? Do we even allow that? Right. And just putting in all of those factors, because maybe in the EU, it's like, okay, if you have work authorization in any of the EU countries, that has to be a criteria, or we can't move you there. Or now we can't because of Oyster. But thinking through those things of like, how much do we want to tackle in terms of this? Because immigration costs are a thing. Moving people around, it definitely has cost to it. So what does that look like?
Yeah, I think there's so many like hidden pieces that you don't truly understand as an employee. You just think, well, I can go and work there, and right to work is critical, right? And that is critical. And interestingly, just because you have a citizenship, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got the right to work, right? So there's a lot of nuance behind that in itself. I think to your point as well, Vicki, like what are the parameters? And ultimately, as a people team, we're there to safeguard, right? The last thing we want is somebody relocating to a location. Suddenly they realize the ramifications of that on their taxes, right? Or, on other areas that touch them as individuals in their real lives, right? It hurts. So I think, although not constrained by geographic requirements, I think it is really, really important that you're taking into consideration and making sure that you're looking at those steps as well. There are implications potentially on equity, right? As part of your total comp, dependent on where you are in the world, and whether that's something that's offered within that regional location. But also as a business, right? Like, hey, I'm a sales individual within the EMEA market, and I've got the knowledge and the skills, and I'm employed to do that, and I want to relocate to the Americas. Well, do we have a position there? Because the reality is you're not going to be able to really do your role to the full extent that you need to from a time zone that's, a good 7, 8, sometimes 9 hours behind where your customers sit in your market. So you also have to really, as a business, look at, what's feasible when it comes to, can a role be anywhere? Or does a role need to have a certain positioning within the world because of the business need as well? So getting clear on that and providing guidelines and parameters are really important. I think you need two things: a global relocation policy, but you also need a travel policy as well, because you might not be there forever. You might just want to go and travel, right? And have 3 months digital nomad, or whatever that might be in your situation. You can go and be in that state or that country for a certain period as well. So there's two sides to that.
Super interesting. Thanks for such a comprehensive answer, both of you. Thanks again for our speakers, sponsors, and attendees. Hope everyone has a great rest of their week. This has been Growing and Engaging Remote and Hybrid Teams with Stacey Slater and Vicki Yang, sponsored by HR Chief, People, and Oyster. Thanks so much for everyone for hanging out. Hope you all have a great rest of your week. And until next time, take care. We will end things there. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.